In the sun-soaked streets of Los Angeles, a city of glitz and glamour, not everything was as it seemed. The allure of fame, fortune, and beauty lured thousands to the Golden State every day. But for some, the glittering surface hid a darker truth. Nicole Saunders, a successful hairstylist, was living the life most people only dreamed of. She had built her reputation from scratch, working her way up from a small salon in Santa Monica to her own luxurious studio in West Hollywood. Clients adored her, and she had the perfect blend of talent, beauty, and charm that made her a sought-after name in the industry. But beneath the shiny surface, Nicole was struggling. She had a small circle of friends and only one who truly knew her. That was Emily Harris, her best friend since high school. Emily wasn't just any friend, she was Nicole's confidant, the person she called when things went wrong or when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. But Emily was also a woman who believed in fairy tales, who loved the idea of a perfect life, and who often found herself chasing dreams that didn't always exist. That is where things went wrong. It started innocently enough. Emily had recently signed up for a dating app, something Nicole had gently mocked her for, but with encouragement nonetheless. Emily had been single for years, after a disastrous relationship that left her heartbroken. She'd been hesitant at first, but after weeks of scrolling and swiping, she matched with a man named Jake. He was everything Emily wanted, handsome, charming, and with a job that seemed too good to be true. Jake claimed to be a high-powered businessman who often traveled between Europe and the United States. They exchanged messages for a few weeks before Jake suggested they speak on the phone. Nicole had heard Emily talk about Jake nonstop, her voice filled with excitement and giddiness every time they spoke. Nicole, though skeptical, kept her thoughts to herself, thinking it was just a harmless infatuation. After all, Emily was not the type to get carried away easily, but that's exactly what happened. Emily fell for him completely. The phone calls became more frequent. They spoke for hours, discussing their hopes, dreams, and futures. Jake told Emily he loved her and was making plans to come to Los Angeles to meet her. Nicole, still unsure about the whole situation, decided to check on things herself. She made some casual inquiries trying to gather some information about Jake's supposed business dealings, but every lead she followed turned cold. It was only when Emily told Nicole that Jake had asked her to send him money that things began to feel off. At first, Emily had hesitated, but Jake had a story. He claimed that his business had hit a rough patch, and he needed help covering some unexpected expenses. Emily, blinded by love, agreed without thinking twice. A few $100s here, a few thousand there. It seemed harmless until the sums grew larger. Over the course of a few months, Emily had sent Jake $350,000. Nicole was horrified when she found out. She immediately confronted Emily, urging her to stop sending money. But Emily was adamant. Jake was in trouble, and if she didn't help, he might lose everything. The warning signs were everywhere, but Emily couldn't or wouldn't see them. Her best friend, who had always been sharp and cautious, was now completely entranced by a man who may not even exist. Nicole couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to stop it. One fateful night, everything came to a head. Emily invited Nicole over to her apartment, saying she needed her support. When Nicole arrived, she found Emily sitting on the floor, surrounded by empty wine bottles, her face tear-streaked and puffy. She'd just received another message from Jake, who had promised to come to LA in person to meet her. Nicole took one look at her friend's broken state and knew that things were beyond repair. She had to take action, but she didn't know where to start. As Emily sobbed uncontrollably, Nicole's frustration turned to anger. How could her best friend have been so blind? The rage was bubbling up inside her, and in the heat of the moment, something snapped. In a moment of rage, Nicole did something she never thought herself capable of. She grabbed a kitchen knife from Emily's counter and in an instant, plunged it into her best friend's chest. Emily gasped, her eyes widening in shock as she looked up at Nicole. It was over in seconds, her life slipping away in a pool of blood. Nicole stood frozen, staring at the woman who had been her everything, the woman she had known since childhood. What had she just done? The reality of her actions hit her like a freight train, but it was too late to undo it. Nicole's mind raced, thoughts scrambling in every direction. She had killed Emily, and the reasons for it seemed to blend with her grief, guilt, and anger. The girl who had always been so driven and composed now found herself in the most horrifying situation imaginable. The phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Jake. "I'm on my way, baby. I'll be there soon." Nicole knew there was no turning back now. She had to cover her tracks. What she didn't know was that Emily's death was just the beginning. The authorities would soon get involved, and they would uncover a story of betrayal, deception, and murder, a story that would captivate the entire city. The lights of Los Angeles continued to flicker through the windows of Emily's apartment, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded within. The city of Los Angeles never stopped moving. Its pulse thrummed through the streets, from the crowded cafes of Santa Monica to the exclusive restaurants of Beverly Hills. But as Nicole Saunders drove away from Emily's apartment that night, the city seemed distant, its gleaming lights just a blur in the rearview mirror. The weight of what had just occurred bore down on her, suffocating her every breath. She hadn't planned on killing Emily. In fact, it had happened in a flash of rage, anger and betrayal pouring out of her all at once. Nicole could barely remember the details. She had just wanted to stop Emily from being so gullible, from letting this Jake drain her of everything she had. But now, in the cold silence of the car, Nicole felt the overwhelming reality of what she'd done. The minutes stretched into hours as she drove aimlessly through the night, her mind running in circles. She couldn't go home. No, there was no way she could face anyone, especially after what had happened. The one person she loved the most was gone, and Nicole had taken her from the world. Nicole wasn't sure what to do next. The logical thing was to call the police to confess, but that would mean giving up everything she had worked for. It would mean ending her career, her life as she knew it. And the worst part was the fear of being linked to the scam, the one that Emily had been caught in. If she went to the authorities, they would investigate the whole story. Jake, the money, the lies. But as much as she feared getting caught, Nicole couldn't bear the idea of anyone else discovering the truth about Emily's death. No one could know about the rage that had overtaken her. Not her clients, not her friends, not even the police. It was her secret, and she would bury it. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. Jake. Her stomach twisted, and for a second she considered ignoring the message. But curiosity got the better of her, and she unlocked her phone to read it. "Hey, baby, I'm here. Where are you? I can't wait to finally see you." Nicole's heart skipped a beat. He was coming to meet Emily. What would he do when he found out she was dead? He had to know. Nicole's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A thought crossed her mind. Maybe she could manipulate him, turn things around. She could tell him that Emily had gotten cold feet, that she'd left Los Angeles without a word. That way, he would never know the truth. But even as the thought formed, Nicole knew that was a lie she could never sell. The truth was ugly, and in her gut, she knew it would all come back to her eventually. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was an incoming call. It was Detective Clara Johnson. Nicole's heart dropped into her stomach. She hadn't heard from the police yet. How could they have known already? Nicole hesitated for a second, her hands shaking. She quickly wiped away the sweat on her palms before answering. "Hello," she said, trying to sound calm. "This is Detective Clara Johnson, Los Angeles Police Department," came the steady voice from the other end of the line. "I'm calling regarding a situation we're investigating. We need to speak to you about your friend, Emily Harris." Nicole felt the blood drain from her face. I don't understand. What's happened to Emily?" she stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I think it's best if we talk in person," Detective Johnson replied. "Where can we meet?" Nicole's mind raced. She had no choice but to go. She couldn't risk making any more mistakes. The calmness in the detective's voice only made her nerves worse. Detective Johnson was sharp. Nicole could tell from the way she spoke, from the control in her tone, that she wouldn't be easy to deceive. "Okay," Nicole replied, her voice cracking. "I'll meet you at my salon," the detective agreed, and the call ended. By the time Nicole arrived at her salon, the world outside felt like it was closing in on her. She parked her car in the alley behind the building, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The lights were dim, the usual hum of the hair dryers and chatter of clients absent. Everything felt eerily quiet. The salon, her safe space, now felt like a trap. A black and white police car was parked outside, and as Nicole walked in, she saw Detective Johnson standing by the front desk, talking to one of the salon assistants. Her calm demeanor was gone now, replaced by the focused, determined look of a seasoned investigator. Behind her was a uniformed officer, clearly ready for anything. Nicole's chest tightened as she walked toward them. "Nicole Saunders," Detective Johnson said, her voice firm yet not unkind. "I'm glad you could meet us. Please have a seat." Nicole took a deep breath and sat down across from the detective. Her mind was still reeling, and she found it hard to focus on anything except the nagging question. What did the police know? Had they figured out what had happened to Emily yet? And how close were they to uncovering the truth? "Detective, what's going on? What happened to Emily?" Nicole asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We found Emily Harris dead in her apartment early this morning," Detective Johnson said, her eyes locking onto Nicole's. "We're still piecing things together, but from the preliminary evidence, it doesn't look like a natural death. We're investigating, and we need to know if you saw her recently. Did you notice anything unusual?" Nicole's mind raced. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the guilt threatening to overwhelm her. The words she had rehearsed in her head were hard to find. Now the truth was just too dangerous. I, I saw her yesterday," Nicole said slowly, her eyes flicking toward the floor. "She was upset. She'd been talking to some guy online for a while, and she thought he was going to come to town, but I didn't know anything was wrong. She didn't seem in any danger, not at the time." "Did she ever mention anything about money?" Detective Johnson asked, leaning forward slightly. "Any unusual requests?" Nicole froze. She could feel the detective's eyes on her, sharp and calculating. She had to be careful. There was no turning back now. She had to control the story. "No," Nicole said quickly. "Nothing like that." The detective gave her a long, searching look, as if weighing her words. "Are you sure? Because we've learned that Emily transferred a significant amount of money to someone recently, over $350,000. We're looking into that as well. You're aware of this, right?" Nicole's heart skipped a beat. They knew about the money. How had they found out so fast? Her mind was spinning. She could feel the walls closing in. The truth was slipping through her fingers. But Nicole wasn't ready to let it all unravel just yet. "I had no idea," she replied, her voice tight. "I just know she was taken in by this guy. She really thought he cared about her." "Interesting," Detective Johnson said, her voice cool but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "We're going to need your full cooperation, Nicole, and I suggest you don't leave town until we're finished with our investigation." Nicole nodded, swallowing hard as she stood up. "Of course, Detective. Anything I can do to help." As the detective and her team left the salon, Nicole stood there in the silence, the reality of what had happened crashing down on her. The investigation had only just begun, and she had to make sure her secret remained buried, no matter the cost. Detective Clara Johnson didn't return to the precinct right away after leaving Nicole's salon. She knew that the case surrounding Emily Harris' death was far more complicated than it appeared at first glance. There was something nagging at her. Something didn't feel right. Nicole Saunders' story, though delivered with apparent sincerity, didn't sit well with her. There was an edge to her that Johnson couldn't quite pinpoint. The salon owner had been too quick to deny any knowledge of the money, too eager to play the role of the concerned friend. Johnson had seen enough in her years of service to know that people often gave away more than they intended when they were trying to hide something. Detective Johnson's first stop after the meeting was the crime scene, Emily Harris's apartment in Silver Lake. The Los Angeles Police Department's forensics team had already been through the place, cataloging evidence and preserving anything that might help solve the mystery. Emily's apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a quiet part of town. It was the kind of place where people went about their business unnoticed, tucked away from the chaos of Hollywood or downtown LA. Yet in that little apartment, a life had been tragically taken. The scene was still fresh in the air, faint traces of blood, a couple of overturned wine glasses, and the ever-present scent of fear and grief. But one thing stood out to Clara. The place was devoid of any significant personal touches. No framed pictures of family or friends, no souvenirs from trips. There were just a few books scattered on the coffee table and a couple of handbags tossed carelessly on the couch. It seemed like Emily had kept to herself, or perhaps, Clara thought, a part of her life had been kept hidden. There was no sign of the man who had purportedly been the center of Emily's world. Jake. Clara took a deep breath and continued her examination of the apartment. She noted that there was no forced entry. The front door had been locked, and there was no sign of a struggle in the hallway or living room. The only evidence of violence was in the bedroom, where Emily's lifeless body had been discovered. The coroner's report had confirmed it. Emily had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds deep and consistent with a swift, fatal attack. The lack of defensive wounds suggested Emily hadn't seen it coming. Whoever had killed her was likely someone she trusted. Someone close. Her mind briefly returned to Nicole. The hairstylist's reaction to the news of Emily's death had been curious. While her shock had seemed genuine, the way she held herself back during their conversation made Clara uneasy. But Clara knew she couldn't make assumptions based on gut feelings alone. She needed to dig deeper. As she walked back to her car, Clara reviewed the case file again. Emily Harris had been a regular at the salon owned by Nicole Saunders, which immediately piqued her interest. It was clear that their friendship was more than just superficial. They had shared a long history. Nicole had called Emily a best friend more than once during their conversation. Yet there was something unsettling about the way she had responded to questions, something hidden beneath her calm exterior. The next step was clear. Clara needed to dig into Nicole's past, her financials, and her connections. She also needed to take a closer look at the online persona of the mysterious Jake. A deep dive into Nicole's background. Back at the precinct, Clara sat in her office going over Nicole Saunders' records. She was determined to find anything that could connect Nicole to the murder. So far, the clues seemed scattered and incomplete, but Clara was experienced in reading between the lines. Nicole had been living a successful life on the surface. Her salon had grown over the past few years, and she had a respectable reputation. Yet there was something odd about her financial records. Though she was making a healthy income from her salon, there were significant discrepancies in her bank statements over the past year. Small withdrawals, usually amounts under $500, had been made from her account to an untraceable recipient. The amounts were frequent, yet didn't appear to correspond with any legitimate business expenses. At first, Clara thought they were merely the result of careless spending, but the more she looked, the more those withdrawals seemed to stand out. Could they have been payments to someone? Or perhaps they were tied to the mysterious man Jake? Clara contacted her colleagues to initiate a deeper investigation into Nicole's financial history. She also requested a full background check on Nicole's salon's finances, including employee records, income reports, and tax filings. Everything had to be scrutinized. The deeper Clara dug, the more she realized there was something troubling beneath Nicole's perfect image. No one becomes that successful in LA without secrets. The pattern of small, frequent payments could easily be explained away as business expenses. But Clara knew better than to trust appearances. Everything about Nicole's life screamed that there was more to the story. Meanwhile, a team of cyber investigators had been working to trace Jake's online presence. The first place they started was the dating app Emily had used, the one where she had met him. After an exhaustive search, they discovered that the profile Emily had matched with appeared to have been created only a few months ago. The profile was picture perfect. Jake, a tall, athletic man with a dashing smile, claiming to be a high-level executive in some tech company with operations across the globe. But when they dug deeper, the leads went cold. The phone number Jake had provided Emily didn't lead anywhere, and the email address was registered under a generic name, without any ties to a legitimate business or individual. Clara's suspicions grew. It was becoming clear that Jake didn't exist, or at least not in the way Emily had imagined him. Clara ordered a full sweep of the IP addresses connected to Jake's online communications with Emily, but it became apparent that the person behind the mask of Jake was deliberately hiding his identity. Whoever it was had gone to great lengths to conceal their real life. Still, the money was the key. Emily had sent over $350,000 to someone, and that money had to go somewhere. It wasn't just a matter of love or betrayal. There was a financial motive here, and Clara had a feeling that whoever was behind Jake had manipulated Emily for far longer than anyone had realized. Clara was beginning to understand that this was more than just a tragic love story gone wrong. Nicole Saunders, Emily's best friend, had likely played a bigger role in all of this than she was letting on. There was something about the way Nicole had reacted to the police's questions that hinted at her deeper involvement. Nicole had a motive. She had been a part of the scam, and it seemed clear that the killing was more than just a crime of passion. It was the desperate act of someone who had watched her best friend be destroyed, someone who had lost control over a situation they couldn't fix. The lies, the manipulation, and now murder. Nicole Saunders had tried to bury the truth, but Clara was determined to bring it all into the light. The investigation was heating up, and Clara knew it was only a matter of time before she cracked the case wide open. Detective Clara Johnson sat at her desk, reviewing the stack of files in front of her. It was early morning, but the hum of the precinct already buzzed around her as she sifted through the tangled mess that was the Emily Harris case. Each layer she uncovered seemed to deepen the mystery. Nicole Saunders, Emily's so-called best friend, was looking more and more suspicious. Her initial gut feeling had proven right. Nicole had a lot more to hide than she had let on. Clara knew there was no such thing as a coincidence in investigations like this, especially when it came to murder. The dots were beginning to connect, and soon Nicole would have no choice but to face the truth. But Clara also knew that it wasn't enough to simply suspect someone. She had to build the case meticulously, piece by piece, until there was no doubt. Nicole had already started weaving a story that didn't quite add up. It was time to turn up the heat. Later that afternoon, Clara received a call from the cyber investigations team. They had managed to make a significant breakthrough. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get Clara's attention. They had traced the IP address connected to Jake's online communications with Emily Harris to a location in Santa Monica, an area that wasn't far from Nicole Saunders' salon. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Santa Monica. That wasn't far at all. The team had discovered something even more interesting. An old account linked to the same IP address, one that had been dormant for years. The account belonged to a man named Aaron Stokes. His online presence had been minimal, but what they found was enough to raise alarms. The man had several different aliases linked to his name, and many of them were connected to various online scams, including one very similar to the one Emily had fallen victim to. The red flags were everywhere. Aaron Stokes, Clara muttered to herself, writing the name down. That's who Jake really is. Now things were starting to take shape. Clara had already known that Jake wasn't who he said he was, but now it seemed clear that Aaron Stokes had been operating under multiple identities. It was the perfect scheme. He could manipulate people without ever showing his true face, and now he was on the radar for a crime far more serious than scamming people out of money. Clara immediately ordered a full investigation into Aaron Stokes. She needed everything on him, his whereabouts, his past, any connections to Nicole Saunders. It was time to dig deeper into this man's life and see how his web of lies connected to Emily's tragic death. As Clara continued her investigation into Aaron Stokes, she turned her attention back to Nicole. She was starting to see a clearer picture. Nicole had been Emily's friend for years, but they hadn't always been close. There had been whispers at the salon about Nicole's financial troubles. Her once thriving business had seen a decline in recent months. She wasn't making the money she used to, and her spending habits had become erratic. Clara needed to know more about Nicole's finances. She wasn't just going to accept the surface-level explanation that Nicole's business was struggling. There had to be more. A visit to the bank was in order. Within hours, Clara had access to Nicole's bank records, and what she found made her stomach turn. Over the last year, Nicole had made several large withdrawals. The transactions matched the same amount that Emily had sent to Jake. There was no way this was a coincidence. Nicole Saunders had been directly involved in the scam. Clara's suspicion was confirmed. Nicole wasn't just a concerned friend. She was part of the scheme, a collaborator. Her role had been more than just standing by while Emily sent her money. Clara believed Nicole had orchestrated the entire thing. She had helped Jake manipulate Emily, possibly even under the guise of being a protector. But when things started to unravel, when Emily started questioning Jake, Nicole had snapped. That was when the murder happened. Clara knew she was getting closer, but there was still a crucial piece missing. The money. Where had it gone? Nicole couldn't have spent all of it herself. This was a complex operation, and there had to be a larger network involved. She wasn't just going after Nicole anymore. Clara was hunting down the entire web of lies. That night, Nicole sat in her salon, staring at her reflection in the mirror. It had been hours since her meeting with Detective Johnson, and the guilt weighed on her. She couldn't stop replaying the moment she'd killed Emily. The shock on her best friend's face, the way the life drained from her body. Nicole had felt powerful in that moment. Powerful because she could control the situation. But now the power had turned into a dark, suffocating weight. Nicole hadn't meant to kill Emily. She hadn't. She'd only wanted to stop her from sending more money. But everything had spiraled out of control. Now she was stuck in a lie that was beginning to unravel. The sound of the door opening jolted her out of her thoughts. She turned, expecting another client. But instead, it was Detective Clara Johnson, walking in with that same focused, unyielding expression. Nicole's stomach dropped. "Nicole Saunders," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Nicole swallowed hard. She tried to maintain her composure, but she could feel the pressure building. She couldn't lie anymore. The walls were closing in. I told you everything I knew," Nicole stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "Emily was just, she was so in love with him, and she was so vulnerable." Clara didn't move closer. She stood in the doorway, watching Nicole with steely eyes. "You're lying," Clara said, her tone cutting through Nicole's excuses like a knife. "I know about the money. I know about Jake. And I know about Aaron Stokes. You've been part of this scam from the beginning." Nicole's heart raced, but she tried to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I tried to protect Emily from him. I swear, Detective, Clara cut her off, stepping closer now. "Nicole, you're not fooling anyone. You were in on it. You knew about the money. You were complicit in everything. And you killed Emily when she became a liability." Nicole froze. Her entire body stiffened as the weight of Clara's words hit her. "I didn't mean to kill her," Nicole whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't let her send him more money. She was drowning, Detective. She was throwing her life away for him, and I just couldn't watch it anymore." Clara looked at Nicole, her expression cold but sympathetic. "You thought you were protecting her, but instead, you took her life. You'll pay for this, Nicole. The whole truth is coming out." Nicole's hands trembled as she sank into the chair. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. What had started as a misguided attempt to save her friend had spiraled into something far darker. And in the end, it was her who would pay the price. The investigation was far from over. Clara had cracked the case wide open, but the deeper she went, the more disturbing the picture became. Nicole Saunders wasn't the only one to blame. Aaron Stokes, or Jake, was still out there. His identity now known, but his whereabouts still a mystery. Clara wasn't going to rest until the entire network was brought down. Nicole Saunders had played her part, but she wasn't the mastermind. There was someone else pulling the strings, someone much more dangerous, and Clara would find them. Detective Clara Johnson felt a weight lift as she left Nicole Saunders' salon after their tense conversation. The evidence was mounting. The pieces were fitting together, and Nicole had finally cracked under the pressure. But despite Nicole's confession, Clara knew the case was far from over. Nicole had been a part of a larger scam, one orchestrated by someone even more dangerous. The person who had pulled the strings from the shadows, making Emily Harris and countless others fall into his trap. Nicole had confessed to everything: her involvement in the scam, the financial manipulation, and the murder. But there was still one crucial part of the puzzle missing. Aaron Stokes, or Jake, as he had gone by in his communications with Emily, was still a ghost. No one knew where he was, and that made Clara's skin crawl. If he was anything like the profile she had built of him, clever, manipulative, and calculating, he would stop at nothing to avoid capture. The longer he remained free, the greater the chance of more victims. Clara couldn't afford to waste any more time. She needed to bring Aaron Stokes in, and she needed to do it fast. After Nicole's confession, Clara had ordered an immediate search for Aaron Stokes. The cyber investigators had already found a handful of false identities and aliases tied to him. There were numerous digital footprints, none of them leading to anything solid, just a trail of deception, fraud, and manipulation. But now Clara was going to take a different approach. The digital trail had already been covered, but Stokes wasn't entirely invisible. He was good, but he wasn't perfect. And Clara had one more trick up her sleeve, one that had worked for her many times in the past. She was going to dig into his past. The first step was clear: go back to the beginning. Clara visited the small, nondescript house in Culver City that Aaron Stokes had once lived in. The property had been sold years ago, but records showed he had lived there in his late 20s. It wasn't much. A small, two-bedroom home, no different from any of the other modest houses in the area. But it was the key to understanding Aaron's life, his roots, and maybe even his next move. The house had been sold under a different name. Of course, Stokes had used one of his many aliases when he sold the property, and no one had ever questioned it. But Clara wasn't about to let that stop her. The current owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, remembered Aaron vaguely. She recalled that he had always kept to himself, never socialized with the neighbors. A quiet man, she said. She also remembered that Aaron had a roommate at one point, a man named Thomas Larkin. But Thomas had vanished after Aaron moved out. That was interesting. Clara had already checked Aaron's criminal history, but Thomas Larkin had never appeared on any of the records. Could he be another one of Stokes's aliases? Or was he a victim, another pawn in Stokes's game? Ruth had no further information to offer, but Clara had her lead. Thomas Larkin could be the missing piece. Clara immediately contacted the missing persons department to see if anyone had reported a Thomas Larkin in the last few years. They found a match. Thomas had disappeared nearly 2 years ago, just a few months after Aaron had moved out of the Culver City house. This was no coincidence. The search for Thomas Larkin led Clara into a grim new direction. She uncovered that Thomas had been reported missing by his family after a long period of silence. His parents had given up on him, thinking he had simply gone off the grid, but something about the case was starting to feel more sinister. Clara found a trail of information that suggested Thomas had become involved in the same online schemes that Aaron had been running. It was possible that Thomas had once been Aaron's accomplice, or perhaps he had even been a victim of Aaron's manipulation. Clara couldn't be sure yet, but one thing was becoming clear. Thomas Larkin and Aaron Stokes were deeply connected. The deeper Clara dug, the more disturbing the picture became. It turned out that Thomas had used a different alias in some of the scam operations, an alias linked to multiple accounts in online dating schemes. Clara pieced it together. Aaron had used Thomas to manage some of the accounts that Emily had communicated with. And, perhaps most chilling of all, Clara discovered that Thomas had been posing as Jake in some of his conversations with Emily. He had been the voice, the one who had won Emily's trust and ultimately convinced her to send over hundreds of thousands of dollars. But then something had gone wrong. Thomas had either realized how deep the scam was becoming, or he had fallen out of favor with Aaron. Clara couldn't decide which. What she did know was that Thomas had disappeared soon after Aaron stopped using the Jake persona to communicate with Emily. It was likely that Thomas had tried to pull away from the operation, or that Aaron had disposed of him once he became a liability. The connections were becoming clearer by the hour, but Clara's stomach churned with the realization that Aaron had manipulated not just Emily, but Thomas as well. It was starting to feel like a web of destruction, one that had ensnared everyone in its path. Clara took a step back to consider the situation. Aaron Stokes was no longer just a fraudster. He was a cold-blooded manipulator who used people until they were no longer useful to him. And Emily had become his final victim, someone who had been driven to the point of no return, sending all her money to a man who wasn't even real. Nicole had killed Emily in a fit of rage, unable to watch her best friend ruin her life any further. But it was Aaron who had set the whole thing in motion. He had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes, and Nicole had been his willing accomplice. The money had been just one piece of the puzzle, but the murder had been the tipping point, the point where Nicole finally lost control. Clara's phone buzzed. It was her cyber team. They had a hit. "We tracked down Aaron," the voice on the other end of the line said. He's holed up in an apartment complex in Venice Beach. We're moving in now. We'll have him in custody soon. Clara's pulse quickened. This was it. After weeks of hunting, they were finally going to catch him. Aaron Stokes wasn't going to slip away this time. Clara arrived at the apartment complex just as the team was closing in on the suspect's location. The area was quiet, the evening air crisp, but Clara could feel the tension building. They had traced Aaron's movements through the building, and he was holed up in one of the top-floor units. His last known contact had been a burner phone, which had finally led them to him. The SWAT team moved in first, their boots hitting the stairs with a quiet thud. Clara was right behind them, her heart pounding as she prepared to face the man who had caused so much destruction. This was the moment. They reached the door to the apartment, and with one swift motion, the team breached it. The room was dimly lit, and there, sitting on the couch, was Aaron Stokes. He didn't move when the team entered, but Clara saw the flash of fear in his eyes. It was over. Aaron Stokes was arrested without resistance, and as he was let out of the apartment, Clara couldn't help but feel a grim sense of victory. But she knew this wasn't the end. The web of lies had been exposed, and the truth was finally coming to light. The case was closed, but the damage caused by Aaron's manipulation would leave a scar that would never heal. Detective Clara Johnson stared at the sterile walls of the interrogation room, the air thick with tension. The scent of coffee lingered, but the warmth from the drink couldn't ease the weight she felt pressing down on her. It had been hours since Aaron Stokes had been brought in, but she knew that what would happen in the next few minutes was the true test of everything she had uncovered. The man seated across from her was no longer the confident, manipulative fraudster who had orchestrated the scam that ruined Emily Harris's life. No, now Aaron Stokes was cornered, and there was no escape. He had been read his rights, his lawyer had been notified, and the charges were stacked high against him. Yet Clara knew that even in a room full of law enforcement, Aaron still held a certain power, a dangerous power. He was a master manipulator, and this interrogation could go any number of ways. But Clara wasn't going to give him that chance. She was prepared. Aaron Stokes was escorted into the room by two officers, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was tall, with dark, carefully combed hair, wearing an outfit that still looked too pristine, too perfect for someone who had just been arrested. His eyes were cold and calculating, studying the room with a sharpness that belied his situation. Despite his arrest, he didn't seem like a man who had been caught. No, he seemed like a man who was still in control of the situation, still playing the game. Clara stood up as he was seated, studying his every move. There was no sign of fear, no tremor in his hands. Just the calm, practiced poise of someone who had done this before. She sat down opposite him, meeting his gaze with the same intensity. "You're in a lot of trouble, Aaron," Clara said, her voice low, purposeful. "You've scammed countless people, destroyed lives, and—" "I didn't scam anyone," Aaron interrupted smoothly, a self-assured smirk crossing his lips. "I helped people. I gave them love, support, everything they wanted. They came to me willingly. If anyone's to blame here, it's Emily, or any of the others who fell for it. Not me." Clara's patience didn't waver. She had heard it all before. The deflection, the manipulation. She had studied criminals like him long enough to recognize the pattern. He wasn't remorseful, not even close. He was spinning his narrative, as he always did. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the table. "You killed Emily Harris. You manipulated her into sending you $350,000, and when she started asking questions, you had your friend do the dirty work for you. Nicole Saunders killed her for you, Aaron." Aaron's face twitched. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his features, but it was brief, too quick to catch. He didn't like that she knew the details. "I never told Nicole to kill anyone," Aaron said, his voice tight. "That was her choice. You can't pin that on me." Clara raised an eyebrow, her voice unwavering. "You're a fraud, Aaron. You're a liar, and you used Emily, just like you've used so many others. You convinced her that you were someone you weren't, manipulated her emotions, and bled her dry. She trusted you with everything, and you betrayed that trust. You don't get to hide behind your lies anymore. Aaron fell silent for a moment, his jaw clenching as he processed her words. His smirk faltered, but just for a second. Then he leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him as if he were contemplating his next move. Clara knew that she had to break him, and she was willing to play the long game. She wasn't going to let him walk out of that room thinking he had any control left. Her eyes never left his, watching as his calculated demeanor began to show signs of cracking. "You've been running this scam for years, Aaron," Clara continued. "You've done it to countless women, pretending to be their savior, their soulmate. But in the end, you don't care about them. You only care about the money. You're a parasite, taking advantage of anyone you can. But with Emily, it went too far. You pushed her to the brink. And you know what happened next." Aaron shifted in his seat. The cold, calculated facade was starting to chip away. He wasn't smiling anymore. Clara pressed on, knowing that he was close. "Nicole Saunders confessed to everything. She admitted to killing Emily because you pushed her to the edge. She was desperate to stop Emily from sending more money. But you, Aaron, you set the whole thing in motion. You manipulated her into believing she was saving her best friend from herself. You knew what would happen if Emily refused to stop. You knew." Aaron's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was no charm, no facade of innocence. His shoulders stiffened, and his fingers twitched. Clara could see that he was struggling internally. His mind was working overtime, calculating how much he could reveal without implicating himself further. Clara's voice softened, almost coaxing. "You don't have to hide behind your lies anymore, Aaron. The truth is already out there. Nicole is going to take the fall for the murder, but you're the one who started all of this. It's time to stop playing games." For a moment, Aaron didn't speak. His gaze dropped to the table, his thoughts swirling. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he exhaled. It was the first sign of resignation. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes slowly lifted to meet Clara's, and this time there was no deflection, no pretense, just raw bitterness. "You think this is all about the money, about the scam? I don't care about that. The money means nothing. It's all about control. I gave them everything. I gave them love, hope, everything they could ever want. And when they wanted more, I gave them that too. It wasn't just about the money. It was about having someone to control, someone to need me. Emily was supposed to be mine. And when she started questioning me, when she started trying to pull away, that's when I had to take action." Clara remained still, her gaze never wavering as he continued, a mix of anger and regret creeping into his voice. "I didn't want her dead, Clara. I didn't. But I wasn't going to let her ruin everything. Nicole, she understood. She knew what had to be done, and she did it. She took care of it. I didn't ask her to, but I didn't stop her either." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and distant again. "I gave Emily everything she ever wanted. She was mine, and she threw it all away. She ruined everything. And for what? So I wouldn't have to be alone anymore. So I wouldn't have to keep running? But that's not the way it works, is it? No one gets to walk away from me. No one." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had cracked him, but what had been revealed was darker than she had expected. Aaron wasn't just a scammer. He was a narcissist, a manipulator, someone who viewed people as mere objects in his twisted game. He didn't care about the people he hurt. He only cared about his control. Aaron's confession wasn't a full one. It was clear that he wasn't going to give up everything. He was still holding on to pieces of the truth, playing his final cards. But Clara didn't need everything. She had enough. She stood up, her decision final. "Aaron, you'll never control anyone again. Your game is over. You've already lost." As she walked toward the door, she turned back to look at him one final time. His expression hadn't changed. Still cold, still calculating, still twisted. But Clara knew that this was the last time she would ever see that look. He would never manipulate anyone again. And as the door clicked shut behind her, she finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. The investigation was drawing to a close, but there was one thing Clara couldn't shake. There were more victims out there, more people like Emily who had fallen into Aaron's web. His arrest might bring some closure, but the damage he had done stretched far beyond what anyone could repair. The courtroom was filled with a tense hush as the trial of Aaron Stokes began. The air was heavy with anticipation, the weight of justice pressing down on everyone present. Clara Johnson sat in the front row, her gaze fixed on the defense table where Aaron sat, as composed as ever, his cold eyes scanning the room with that same unsettling confidence. Even now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he carried himself like a man who thought he could still control the narrative. But Clara knew better. The case had already been made. The evidence was irrefutable, and Aaron Stokes was about to face the consequences of a lifetime of manipulation, deceit, and murder. The prosecution's team, led by a seasoned attorney named Megan Alvarez, moved with precision. Clara had worked closely with Megan in the weeks leading up to the trial. It was a case of mounting evidence: text messages, emails, fake identities, and ultimately, Nicole Saunders' confession. They had the whole operation mapped out, from the very beginning of the scam to the tragic murder of Emily Harris. There was no escaping the truth now. Megan stood up, addressing the court with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about deception, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. For years, Aaron Stokes preyed on vulnerable individuals, manipulating them through online relationships, promising them love, and then stripping them of their dignity and their money. And when one of his victims, Emily Harris, began to see through his lies, Mr. Stokes pushed her into a corner, convinced that she would ruin everything he had built. Nicole Saunders, his accomplice, was coerced into carrying out his dark, twisted plan. But make no mistake, Aaron Stokes was the mastermind. He orchestrated everything. He ruined lives. And in the end, he took the life of an innocent woman. We have the evidence to prove that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Clara listened intently as Megan outlined the case, showing photos of Emily's devastated home, the countless bank transactions that led to the $350,000 Aaron had conned out of her, and the chilling text messages between Aaron and Nicole before the murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had no remorse, no empathy, just a singular drive for control and manipulation. When it was Nicole Saunders' turn to testify, the courtroom grew even quieter. Nicole had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, and though she had been complicit in Emily's murder, her words carried weight. She was the final link between Aaron Stokes and the tragedy that had unfolded. Nicole walked to the witness stand with her head down, her once confident posture now slumped in shame. She had been a proud woman once, successful, vibrant, and full of life. But now she was a broken figure, worn down by guilt and regret. She was no longer the friend who had stood by Emily's side through thick and thin. She was the person who had ended that friendship, taken everything from Emily, and in doing so, changed her own life forever. Nicole's testimony was long and emotional. She spoke of her friendship with Emily, of how she had watched her best friend fall deeper and deeper into the scam, sending money without ever questioning the man behind the name. She described her confusion and frustration as Emily's obsession with Aaron grew, and how at first she tried to protect her. But then, when the stakes grew higher, when Emily's finances became a source of tension, Nicole had been dragged into Aaron's web. Nicole detailed the night Emily had come to her apartment, pleading for answers, for help. Emily had wanted out, but it was too late. Aaron had threatened to ruin her life if she didn't comply, and Nicole had believed him. She had been a victim too, but unlike Emily, she hadn't had the strength to escape. So when Aaron had asked her to end the charade, to kill Emily, Nicole had gone through with it. In her eyes, it was the only way to stop the madness. "I didn't want to do it," Nicole sobbed, her voice breaking. "But I thought it was the only way to protect her. I thought she was lost. Aaron convinced me that it was the only way she would stop. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared." Her confession brought tears to many in the courtroom, and Clara, despite the gravity of the situation, couldn't help but feel a measure of sympathy for Nicole. She had been just as much a victim in this as Emily. Nicole had allowed herself to be manipulated by Aaron, and in the end, she had paid the price. But it didn't excuse what had happened. As expected, Aaron Stokes took the stand in his own defense. He had been silent for most of the trial. his defense team maintaining the position that he was not guilty of murder, that he was merely a victim of circumstance. But as soon as he opened his mouth, it was clear that Aaron was still playing his game. "I'm not a criminal," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "What I did was help people. I gave them something they needed. I gave Emily the love she had been searching for. She trusted me, and I trusted her. I didn't want her to send me money. I didn't need it. She offered it willingly. And when she wanted to leave, it wasn't because she was scared of me. It was because she was confused. She didn't understand what we had." He spoke in soft, persuasive tones, like he was speaking directly to the jury, trying to weave a narrative of innocence. But Clara saw through it. She had heard his manipulation before, and now it was more evident than ever. He was a man who thought he could control everything, even the courtroom. "I didn't kill her," Aaron continued. "I never wanted any of this to happen. What happened between Nicole and Emily was a tragedy, but it wasn't my fault. I was just a man trying to make a living, and now I'm being punished for loving someone too much." The jury listened intently, but Clara could see the cracks in Aaron's story. He wasn't convincing anyone. He was a man who had lost control, and now he was trying to salvage what he could. It was too little, too late. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Clara sat anxiously, her eyes fixed on the foreperson as they stood to announce the decision. She felt the tension in the room as everyone waited with bated breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Stokes, guilty of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud." The words echoed in Clara's mind as the reality of the conviction sank in. Aaron Stokes was guilty. He would pay for what he had done, what he had taken from so many people, but most of all, from Emily Harris. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and anger. Clara felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders, but there was no real sense of victory. Emily was still gone. The damage had already been done. The lives that Aaron had ruined would never return to what they once were. Nicole would have to live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. And as for Aaron, his punishment had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normality. Emily's family held a private memorial for her, and Clara was able to attend, offering what little comfort she could. The pain was still fresh, but there was some solace in knowing that justice had been served. As for Nicole, she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Her guilt weighed heavily on her, but Clara couldn't help but wonder if she had any real chance at redemption. Nicole's life was forever altered, and in many ways, she had become just another casualty of Aaron Stokes' manipulation. Aaron, however, was facing a much harsher reality. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His empire of lies had crumbled, and there was no one left to protect him. Clara sat back in her chair after the final court proceedings were over, allowing herself a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The investigation had been exhausting, the twists and turns relentless, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. But as she thought about Emily, about the others who had been scammed by Aaron, a part of Clara knew that this case would haunt her for years to come. There would always be more stories like this, more victims, more lies, more manipulation, and unfortunately, more people like Aaron Stokes. She stood up, ready to leave the courthouse, knowing that while the case had ended, the work would never truly be over.